I had never been to Meadowhurst before, a sleepy town nestled between forested hills, the kind of place where people go to escape the chaos of the city. I wasn't there by choice. My uncle, whom I had barely known, had passed away, leaving me his estate. His house was the last one on a secluded road, standing tall and worn as though it had been part of the landscape for centuries. When I arrived, it was twilight. The house loomed before me like a giant in slumber, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight. The air felt dense, as if I had crossed an invisible barrier into another world. My uncle's lawyer had handed me a single key with an odd warning: the house keeps secrets. Be mindful. At first I brushed it off as small-town superstition. But the moment I stepped through the heavy wooden door, I noticed something odd. The house wasn't silent. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old structure settling into its foundation. It sounded alive. The walls seemed to hum faintly, a rhythmic vibration like a heartbeat. The foyer smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, almost metallic. Dust coated the ornate furniture, and the air felt unnaturally warm, though the evening outside was crisp. I placed my bag down and wandered through the rooms, each one more peculiar than the last. The wallpaper in the study seemed to ripple when I walked by, as though responding to my presence. A faint draft whispered my name just once, but when I turned, the room was empty. I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, it had been a long drive. The strangest part was the attic. The house was old, yet the attic door was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The key the lawyer gave me didn't work on it either. There was no lock, no visible mechanism, just a smooth, seamless surface that made my skin crawl. The first night was restless. The house wasn't quiet, it exhaled. Long, drawn-out breaths that rattled the windows and made the floorboards tremble. At first I thought it was the wind, but when I looked outside, the trees stood still. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the direction of the attic. It was rhythmic and deliberate, almost like a code. My heart pounded as I approached the door, but just as I was about to press my ear against it, the noise stopped abruptly. When I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something strange. The mirror in the hallway didn't reflect me. Instead, it showed the hallway behind me, empty except for shadows that didn't belong to any object. I slammed the bedroom door shut and didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to investigate the attic. If there was some kind of animal trapped up there, it would explain the noises. I searched the house for any other way in hidden staircases, ladders, anything. Nothing. As I stood before the attic door, frustrated, I noticed something odd. The keyhole there hadn't been one the night before was now there, a perfectly shaped slit in the wood. Without thinking, I inserted the key the lawyer had given me. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that led into pitch darkness. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of something rotten. As I climbed the stairs, my flashlight flickered, and the sound of my breathing felt amplified. When I reached the top, I found a room that was shockingly empty, just 4 walls and a floor covered in dust. And then I noticed the footprints. Bare human footprints leading from the corner of the room to where I stood. They stopped right in front of me, as if someone had been standing there, staring, waiting. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, and my flashlight died completely. The darkness was absolute, and in it, I heard a voice, a whisper that sounded like my uncle's, though distorted and wet. "Get out." When I finally managed to open the door and stumble out, I was drenched in sweat. The rest of the day I kept hearing the whisper, faint but insistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere. The walls felt alive, their vibrations growing stronger when I stood still for too long. I decided to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was drained, though I had checked it before leaving for Meadowhurst. My phone had no signal, and the landline in the house emitted only static. That night, the breathing grew louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't the house settling, it was alive, its rhythms too deliberate. The walls seemed to expand and contract slightly, as if they were inhaling and exhaling. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and I could hear faint laughter from rooms I hadn't entered. The tapping noise returned, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from within the walls. The third day, I found a letter tucked under the bed in the guest room. It was in my uncle's handwriting: "To whomever inherits this house, know that it is not a home but a trap. It feeds on us, our fears, our hopes, our sins. I tried to destroy it, but it won't let me leave. The attic holds the truth, but the truth will cost you everything." That night, I decided to open the attic again. This time, I brought a crowbar and a lantern. The house didn't like it. As I ascended the stairs, the breathing became erratic, like someone hyperventilating. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and the walls pulsed visibly. When I reached the attic, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: a trapdoor in the floor, its edges smeared with what looked like dried blood. I hesitated, but the house didn't give me a choice. The floorboards under me buckled, and I fell through the trapdoor into a room I hadn't seen before, a cavernous space that shouldn't have existed within the house's dimensions. The walls here weren't wood but flesh. They throbbed and oozed, veins snaking across their surfaces. In the center of the room stood a figure, a twisted, grotesque version of my uncle, his face elongated and his limbs unnaturally bent. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped, its voice layered with others. "Now you belong to it." The thing that looked like my uncle started to move closer. Its steps were deliberate but unsteady, as if it wasn't fully in control of its form. Each step left a dark, wet imprint on the fleshy floor, and the smell in the air turned acrid, burning the back of my throat. "You don't have to fight it," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed around me, overlapping itself like a chorus of whispers. "The house only wants what you've already given." I stumbled back, my lantern flickering and barely illuminating the grotesque room. "What does that mean? What does it want?" The figure tilted its head, the movement unnatural, as if its neck were on the verge of snapping. "It wants everything. It wants you." The walls began to close in, the fleshy veins contracting, making the room smaller with every breath. I could feel the house's heartbeat now, strong and rhythmic, vibrating through the soles of my feet. The lantern flickered again, and in the brief flashes of light, I saw shadows skittering across the walls, small, humanoid shapes with elongated fingers and hollow, eyeless faces. I screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly at the nearest shadow, but it passed through as though it weren't solid. The thing wearing my uncle's face laughed, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that seemed to rattle the very air around me. "You can't leave," it said. "Not now. You've seen too much. I didn't ask for this." I shouted, my voice trembling. "I didn't ask for any of this." "And yet, here you are," it replied, raising one twisted hand. The veins in the walls pulsed faster, and the shadows began to coalesce into more solid forms. They stepped out of the walls one by one, their movements jerky and insect-like. Each of them carried a faintly human resemblance, as though they'd been formed from broken memories. My chest tightened with terror, and I realized I couldn't catch my breath. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the house were stealing it from me. I stumbled toward the trapdoor, desperate to climb out, but the fleshy walls grew higher, closing me in like a cage. The shadows began to circle, their eyeless faces turned toward me. Their hollow mouths opened wide, and I heard something that wasn't sound but pure emotion, anguish, despair, and rage, all wrapped into a single, crushing wave that made my knees buckle. "You can stop this," the thing said, stepping closer. "Just give it what it wants." "What does it want?" I rasped, my vision blurring. The walls were closing in faster now, the floor rippling beneath my feet like a living thing. "You," it whispered. "Every part of you, your memories, your soul, your existence." I screamed, clutching the crowbar tighter. "Then it's not getting me without a fight." I swung at the figure, connecting with its twisted form. It let out a howl that shook the room, and black, viscous liquid splattered across the floor. The shadows shrieked in unison, recoiling momentarily before surging forward in a wave. The trapdoor above me flung open with a deafening crack. A shaft of blinding white light poured down, momentarily halting the shadows in their tracks. The thing that wore my uncle's face let out an inhuman roar, shielding itself from the light. "Climb," a voice shouted from above. It was unfamiliar, desperate. "Hurry before it seals again." I didn't think. I just ran, grabbing the edges of the trap door and hauling myself up. Human hands grabbed my arms and pulled me through just as the fleshy walls lunged upward, snapping shut behind me with a sickening squelch. I collapsed onto the attic floor, gasping for air. The room was empty again, as though nothing had happened. The walls were solid wood, and the trapdoor was gone. The person who had pulled me out stood in the shadows, their face obscured. "You shouldn't have opened the attic," they said, their voice low and gravelly. "The house doesn't forgive." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling to stand. My entire body felt like it had been crushed under the weight of a nightmare. "Someone who's been running from this house for far too long," they replied. "But it's not done with you." "What does that mean?" I demanded, but when I stepped closer, they were gone, vanished as though they had never been there. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound I'd heard in that cursed house. My ears rang, and my breathing was shallow as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The attic was empty, its wooden beams and dusty rafters looking entirely mundane, as though the horrors I'd just witnessed had been a twisted hallucination. I turned around, expecting to see the door I'd entered through, but it was gone. Instead, the walls stretched into endless wooden corridors, bending at unnatural angles that made me dizzy just looking at them. The air was thick with the smell of rot, though there was no visible decay. I stumbled forward, gripping the crowbar tightly. My steps echoed in a way that felt wrong, like they weren't my footsteps at all but someone or something following me. The corridor seemed to shift and grow, the walls swelling and contracting with each step I took. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or if the hallway was moving around me. A faint sound broke the suffocating silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. It came from somewhere ahead, growing louder with each passing second. I stopped walking, holding my breath, but the tapping didn't stop. It was getting closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Then came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't come from any direction, they seemed to come from everywhere, echoing off the walls in a cacophony of overlapping voices. I swung the crowbar wildly, hitting nothing but air. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. A door materialized in the wall ahead of me, appearing as if it had always been there. It was old and weathered, its surface covered in deep gouges that looked like claw marks. The doorknob was rusted, and a faint light seeped out from the cracks around its edges. Against all better judgment, I approached it. The light flickered like a flame, casting shadows that danced unnaturally. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to vanish the moment I touched it. But it didn't. It was ice cold under my fingers, and when I turned it, the door creaked open with a groan that echoed endlessly. Beyond the door was a room unlike any other I'd seen in the house. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting an endless series of corridors that stretched into infinity. In the center of the room was a single chair, and sitting in it was me. Or at least it looked like me. The figure was slumped forward, its head hanging low, and its skin was pale and lifeless, as though it had been drained of all vitality. Its hair was the same as mine, its clothes identical, but the thing that made my stomach turn was the reflection or lack thereof. Despite being surrounded by mirrors, the figure in the chair cast no reflection at all. "Don't," a voice said from behind me, low and urgent. I spun around, swinging the crowbar, but there was no one there. The door I'd entered through had vanished, leaving only more mirrors in its place. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. Its expression wasn't mine, it was smiling. "Don't touch it," the voice said again, and this time I realized it was coming from the mirrors. My reflection was speaking, its lips moving in perfect sync with the words. "If you touch it, you'll never leave." "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's happening to me?" The reflection tilted its head, the smile growing wider. "You opened the attic," it said, as though that explained everything. "And now you're part of the house." "I'm not part of anything," I snapped. "I'm getting out of here." "Are you?" it asked, raising an eyebrow. "Look behind you." I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head and my heart dropped. The figure in the chair was no longer slumped forward. It was sitting upright, its head tilted at the exact same angle as the reflection in the mirror, and it was looking straight at me. "Take my place," it whispered, its voice barely audible. "Please." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, no way. You don't have a choice," the reflection said, its smile now stretching impossibly wide. "No one leaves without paying the price." The mirrors around me began to ripple, as though they were made of liquid. My reflection stepped out of the glass, its movements jerky and unnatural, and it started walking toward me. "Stay away," I shouted, swinging the crowbar. It passed straight through the reflection, which didn't even flinch. Behind me, the figure in the chair began to rise, its bones cracking with each movement. I was surrounded. The figure from the chair straightened fully, its movements disjointed, as though it hadn't used its body in years. Its head lolled to one side before snapping upright, and its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The reflection continued its approach, its smile frozen on a face that no longer seemed quite human. I was cornered. The mirrors around me pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow, and the room felt alive, like it was breathing in time with my panicked heartbeat. My thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The reflection spoke again, its voice a hollow echo of my own. "You can't run. You can't fight. The house already has you. I'm not staying here." I screamed, gripping the crowbar like a lifeline. "You think the crowbar will help you?" it asked, tilting its head in mock curiosity. "Do you really think anything will?" From the corner of my eye, I saw the figure from the chair take a shuddering step forward. Its head twisted unnaturally, turning nearly 180 degrees to face me, while its body remained motionless. My stomach churned as it opened its mouth, wider than should have been physically possible, and let out a guttural, choking laugh. "Take my place," it rasped again. "You'll see it's not so bad." "I'm not like you," I shouted, backing toward one of the mirrors. The reflection mirrored my movements, standing just inches away on the other side of the glass. Its smile widened as its hand pressed against the surface. "You already are," it said, and my own voice betrayed me by repeating the words in unison. Desperation took over. I swung the crowbar at the mirror, expecting it to shatter. Instead, it rippled like water, absorbing the blow and throwing me off balance. I stumbled, and in that moment, the figure from the chair lunged. Its cold, skeletal hands gripped my arms, and I screamed as its hollow eyes bore into mine. "You'll take my place," it shrieked, its voice layered with 100 others. I struggled, swinging the crowbar wildly, but the figure's grip was unrelenting. It dragged me closer to the chair, its strength impossibly strong for something so emaciated. Behind me, the reflection watched with glee, its laughter growing louder and more distorted. "You can't win," it said, the words reverberating through the room. "This is where you belong now." "No," I screamed, planting my feet and pushing back with all my strength. For a moment, the figure faltered, its grip loosening just enough for me to wrench one arm free. I swung the crowbar again, this time aiming for its face. The impact was sickening. Its head snapped back with a crunch, but instead of falling, it only laughed, its voice bubbling with unnatural glee. "Pain means nothing here," it rasped. "The house won't let you go." The walls began to close in, the mirrors tilting and warping, as if the house itself was reacting to my resistance. The light in the room dimmed, replaced by a crimson glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Shadows writhed across the walls, taking on monstrous shapes that seemed to watch and mock me. "I'll never be part of this," I shouted, swinging the crowbar again and again. Each blow seemed to do nothing but make the figure laugh harder. My strength was waning, and I could feel the house feeding on my fear, my desperation. Then, in a moment of clarity, I realized what I had to do. The mirrors weren't just reflecting the house, they were part of it. If I couldn't fight the figure directly, maybe I could fight the house itself. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and swung the crowbar at the nearest mirror. This time it didn't ripple. The glass shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The figure let out a deafening screech, and the reflection began to convulse, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You'll destroy everything," the reflection roared, its voice distorted and layered with countless others. "Do you even know what you're doing?" "No," I said through gritted teeth, "but I'm not staying here." I swung again, smashing another mirror. Each time the glass shattered, the room seemed to scream, the walls cracking and splintering as if the house itself was coming apart. The figure released me, stumbling back and clutching its head as it let out an ear-piercing wail. The crimson light flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to dissolve. The reflection in the remaining mirrors screamed in rage, its form becoming more and more unstable. "You'll regret this," it howled. "You'll never escape." I didn't stop. I smashed every mirror I could reach, each blow tearing another piece of the house apart. The floor buckled beneath me, and I stumbled, barely keeping my balance as the entire room began to collapse. Finally, there was only one mirror left, the largest one, directly opposite the chair. The reflection stood within it, its form now barely holding together. It glared at me with pure hatred, its voice a venomous hiss. "You think you've won? You think this is over? The house will always find you." "Maybe," I said, raising the crowbar for one final swing. "But not today." I brought the crowbar down with all my strength. The mirror shattered, and the entire room exploded into darkness. For a moment I felt like I was falling, weightless and suspended in a void. Then, just as suddenly, I hit solid ground. I gasped, my lungs filling with fresh air. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, lying on the overgrown lawn of the house. The sun was rising, casting its warm light over the decrepit structure. The house stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The crowbar was still in my hand, its surface stained with something dark and unidentifiable. I turned and ran, not stopping until the house was nothing more than a distant silhouette on the horizon. Even now, as I write this, I can feel its presence. The house may be gone, but its memory lingers like a shadow that never fully fades. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter,